The always popular Monica Zimmerman.
Thanks, Jack. Well, hello, everybody. Quick question so that I know. How many people am I talking to who heard the talk on Thomas Cole? Excellent. And even if you didn't, it's okay, Audrey, you already know about Thomas Cole. I know that you already know. So I was just kind of making sure that I don't need to do a ton of background to get us to where we are today. Today we're going to focus on the second artist in our series, Asher B. Durand. And here's what I want to preface this with. Asher B. Durand is perhaps the least dramatic of all the landscape painters we're going to focus on in this series, both in terms of the content of what he's doing, his philosophies on it, and his personal life. So that's a warning. But I promise you, I don't like boring stories. This one will still be interesting. But he's not a melodramatic, big-egoed, big world-traveling artist. He's also sort of a late bloomer in terms of his work in landscape. He's kind of knocking around the art world for a while, being accomplished in other ways before he finds his way to landscape. So we're going to see a little bit of that, too, as we build on his story. But he does have perhaps the greatest affinity for the empirical loveliness of the natural world of all the artists that we'll study. So Durand, in particular, appreciates the sturdiness of a beech tree, a bit of moss, or a moderately sized boulder better than almost anybody else in the landscape movement. He doesn't need allegory or metaphor or moral messaging as a reason to depict the American landscape. He isn't, as far as I can tell, nearly as tied up in those moral knots about manifest destiny and preservation that had occupied Thomas Cole. So, we're going to start at the beginning. This is Asher B. Durand, and he is homegrown. He is from Maplewood, New Jersey, what was then known as Jefferson Village, but he's a local boy. And the first jobs that he has are as a watchmaker and a silversmith. He's apprenticing with his father. But really what makes his career is he becomes an engraver. And he actually apprentices with a guy named Peter Maverick in Newark, still in New Jersey, as an engraver. Now, in case you can't picture an engraving in your head, here it is. Now, Peter Maverick, his business specializes in the design of banknotes. So that's actually how Durand learns how to compose a picture originally. And what I find novel about this, that I had no idea about why all of these artists in the early 19th century are engraving banknotes. So it turns out, news to me, maybe news to you, that Andrew Jackson, in an experiment in populism, abolished the Bank of the United States. And so all of these smaller regional and private banks that sprang up were allowed to print their own currencies. So you can imagine the sudden run on compositions to decorate the new banknotes that you as a banker were going to disseminate. Honestly, another lecture series will have to go into how on earth that worked, but I'm desperate to find out now. But Durand masters this discipline very, very quickly. He actually requests during his apprentice years not to do anything original, not to have to make a drawing of his own and then engrave it. He wants to do the hard work of learning the best that there is to learn about composition and technique from the European masters. So basically, for a couple of years, Durand is copying trade cards, letterheads, lottery tickets, diplomas, tickets to horse races, illustrations for books. Everything you now think of as printed visual material back then is mostly done as an engraving. That's the only way that we can disseminate information. So here's another example of a specimen sheet of banknote engravings. And I want to take just a minute at the top of things, because we are going to look at paintings, I promise. But to just kind of give a shout out to engraving to make sure that everybody in 2018 knows what the importance of engraving, if you will. Painting, I think we understand. It's masterful. None of us can do it. It's amazing. But engraving is equally important to the story of art history and far less familiar. So in the time of Durand, in the first half of the 19th century, engraving is probably actually the most popular art form in a lot of ways. Here's one author's summary of the why. Reproducing a painting on a printable metal plate, which is essentially what you're doing when you're engraving someone else's picture, requires of an engraver far more skill and aesthetic insight than is needed to, say, translate a book from one language to another. You might think of it that way, but that's not what it is. Because the translator is operating in the same artistic medium with his original. They're both using words. And the same length, the same amount of words, give or take. But the engraver has to reduce the size of an original image, not uncommonly on a scale of more than 100 to 1. He must communicate the effects of color altogether in black and white, because it is a line drawing on a metal plate. So I thought that I would very quickly for you illustrate how hard this is to do as an engraving with an image that you should be pretty well familiar with. So here you have the Lansdowne portrait by Gilbert Stuart, iconic picture of George Washington. And here are two different engravings. Because what I want you to think about is that you are essentially copying someone else's artistic vision, but without access to the color, the size, or the brushstrokes. You're doing it in black and white using only lines. It's quite a translation. And of course, up until we invent the camera, this is how art is disseminated, not just in the United States, but around the world. So another way to think about it is this. The reputation of most artists of this time and before this time is only as good as the engraver who they commission to engrave their painting to disseminate out into the world. So, being an incredibly accomplished master engraver is no small feat. This is not second-class artisanal work on the part of Durand. This is very important. Artists at that time knew it. They flocked to engravers to study their compositions because they were, really the masters of the fine details of the trade. And they elected them to their academies and sought out the most talented for their projects. And I put this up here. Hopefully you can see, even on this scale and from this far away, how different those two engravings are of a single painting. So Durand masters this trade during the apprenticeship, and he's so good that Maverick brings him on as a business partner, and it becomes Maverick, Durand and Company. And most of the works that he's doing at this time still are basically copies of someone else's composition. But one lucky day for Durand, John Trumbull, the painter of the Revolution, he painted the Declaration of Independence that you see here on the screen, he's looking for just the right person to engrave this iconic piece of public history for all Americans. And it's ready to be distributed widely. He's got his eye on this English engraver named James Heath, but he can't afford Heath's $7,000 fee. Remember the time we're talking about it. That's the worth of the skilled engraver. He's also under pressure to consider trying to find an actual American engraver to engrave the most iconic image of the founding of the country. And so, when he runs into Durand's work, sees the skill, it's a perfect match for both of them. And of course, the importance of this image cannot be understated. It's the defining visual narrative of democracy for most Americans of that time. It's owned by the US Capitol and hangs in the Capitol Rotunda and is also printed on the back of the $2 bill, in case you happen to have any of those lying around. But it turns out that when Maverick, Durand's business partner, finds out that he's gotten this private commission from John Trumbull, all hell breaks loose. From their letters back and forth, it seems like maybe things were already a little tense. Maverick's working out of his farm. Durand's holding down the fort in the city. Things are kind of tense. They're not negotiating very well. And Maverick just basically blows his top that, how dare you, when I'm struggling to feed my kids, I'm the boss, it's my business. We've all heard this between business partners, right? How dare you do this thing that is so self-serving? And so, unsurprisingly, Durand takes the commission, can't turn that down, and the business dissolves by the end of the year. It's just done. And this is his work. From 1820 to 1823, he concentrates almost exclusively on this plate for Trumbull. He did engage in a little bit of other work to supplement income, but it's mostly sort of engravings of portraits of local clergymen, also painted by local painters. But this piece for Durand is hugely important. It is a smashing success. And it makes his name in the circles that he wants to be in the most, that club of artists and the well-heeled businessmen who buy their art. This makes his name for him. And so it's Durand the engraver, not yet Durand the painter, that is actually on walkabout with John Trumbull when they go into Thomas Cole's studio and discover the earliest landscapes that he's made after his first visits to the Hudson. So Durand's actually a little bit more established in his career than Cole is when this all kicks off. Cole's the younger artist, but Durand learns from him and is inspired by him. And by purchasing one of those first 3 tiny Thomas Cole landscapes, Durand actually makes himself one of the first patrons of the American art landscape, if you think about it that way. He's well connected to the art world now. These are his friends and peers. These are the folks that he lunches with at the Bread and Cheese Club. Cole will eventually join them. He becomes a founder of the National Academy of Design, again as an engraver, not yet a painter. So he's in the circle. He's in the circle of makers and thinkers where he wants to be, and he's very good at it. He's still engraving professionally. He joins up with any number of, not any number, 2 businesses, one of which is run by his brother, that are engraving businesses for the rest of that decade. And the firms are very profitable still from this banknote business. They have to keep getting better at the designs that they're designing for banknotes because as quickly as we can make new designs for currency, counterfeiters are making very similar engravings. And it's actually his brother, Cecil Durand, Cyrus Durand, who invents a piece of machinery that does this in such a way that the lines are almost impossible to reproduce, and actually makes it possible for engravings to be sort of a little bit safer from counterfeiting. So he performs a service to make it difficult to manufacture counterfeit plates. So it's not actually until 1830 that we get evidence of Durand's growing interest in the landscape. And even here you can see it's as an engraving. It's not actually as a painting. He agrees to engrave 6 landscapes for the publication of The American Landscape, which is being put together by William Cullen Bryant, who you saw on a previous screen, friend and poet. And 2 of Durand's selections are after his own drawings of the Hudson River area. So we see him now doing something original. Catskill Mountains and Delaware Water Gap that you are seeing here. But he would only truly emerge as painter of landscapes 7 years later. He's going to stay in this zone for a little while. And first, he takes one last detour that's fun and that we must go on together. So in the late spring of 1834, he does something kind of wacky. He buys John Vanderlyn's picture called Ariadne Asleep on the Island of Naxos for the considerable sum of $600. Okay, so Vanderlyn's work itself is incredibly important to the history of American art, if for no other reason than it is the first nude, or one of the first nudes, depending on which art historian you're having coffee with, the first nude to be introduced to the American public. Vanderlyn was studying in Paris when he gets taken by the European traditions of the nudes. He brings it back with him, and he has dreamed up what he thinks is going to be a smashing success of a painting, both for his own career and for the tastes of the American art public he wants to serve, which is still pretty puritanical at that point. He thinks he's going to change the way we look at art. It's shown in New York. He's got the high hopes. And it causes a total sensation. He's absolutely right, and yet absolutely wrong, because it causes the wrong kind of sensation. The America of 1815 is not ready for Ariadne. He doesn't get the critical success he hopes for out of it. And so 20 years later, when Durand shows up interested to buy it, and Vanderlyn's still smarting from this, not at all successful big professional career move, he'd be happy to sell it to anybody, one imagines, and $600 is $600. So he sells this particular piece to Asher B. Durand, who purchases the work, proceeds to paint a small-scale copy of this himself. So there's a Durand version of this painting of Ariadne, and then to engrave his own copy of the painting of van der Linde's Ariadne. And it would be the last great engraving of his career. So it's a whopper. It's an incredible feat that he's got going on here. It's perfectly rendered. It's so perfectly rendered that some scholars I read have really gone down the rabbit hole trying to find every single nuanced difference and imbue it with all kinds of meaning. But it's also sort of a weird American art world white elephant story where, like, you don't want the thing, so I'll take the thing to make my own use out of it. It's an odd scenario. Usually artwork's being passed between two artists like this, or a painting being engraved as part of an actual agreement or a commission. So for Durand to choose to do this of his own free will, it's just odd. And so, unfortunately, the story does not go any better for Durand than it went for van der Linde, except that he spent just as many years engraving the same subject matter. It's not a commercial success. Even though it is a critical success, it is an incredibly skilled engraving of an important work. But it is super interesting that he chooses this. Like, why this? Why this subject of all the paintings you could buy and practice engraving? So one of the reasons it's particularly funny that a scholar has recently done a lot of work on is that we don't know a lot about Durand's personal belief system. He didn't write a lot the same way that Cole did, but he had a reputation for being relatively straight-laced, okay? And while he didn't write quite as explicitly, we do know that he considered both as a friend and a mentor Sylvester Graham, who you see on the screen in front of you. Now, Graham is an eccentric early 19th century reformer who promoted any number of wholesome habits. They included taking exercise in the fresh air, eating bread made from coarsely ground whole wheat, reasonable so far, right? Foregoing stimulating foods, including meats, alcohol, spiced foods, coffee, and tea. And most significantly, the near total avoidance, if possible, of the stimulations of sexual activity. You know, it's like coffee, pretty much. And Graham is a tireless advocate. He's crusading against what he called the deranged physical effects of sex, even within the bonds of marriage. I would just like you to think about that for a second. And he recommended that healthy married males indulge in the act once a month at most. And he reserved his most vociferous denunciations for unproductive sexual pleasure, which I will let you make your own hay of. He argued, he's one of those reformers who's arguing that, if we don't take care of this at the adult level, it's going to infect our public schools, it's going to be in colleges, it's going to lead to still more loathsome and criminal commerces, like these sort of outrageous theories. But Durand is, if not an acolyte, a follower of a lot of these prescriptions. And Graham actually warns that even amorous reveries could lead to, quote, general debility, effeminacy, disordered functions, and permanent disease, even premature death, without the actual exercise of the genital organs being involved. So just in your minds, people, be very, very careful. And so he prescribed a very restrictive, specialized diet that, as far as I know, Durand probably did some of, but not all of, to prevent overactive sexuality. And one of the things that we can thank him for in 2018 is the invention of the graham cracker. Thanks, Crazy Graham. And what I find deliciously ironic is that at this point, I think that perhaps Mr. Graham would be rather horrified that the food he created for human wholesomeness has now been co-opted for absolute gluttony, like the most American snack food. So my point is, first of all, I had to tell you that because I just couldn't not do it. The point is, it's a weird choice for Durand to have chosen Ariadne. And it also, it marks this weird moment of change for Durand. It's a time of chaos and grief. His wife has just suddenly died. And right before that, they had lost a daughter. And right after his wife dies, he would lose his mother. And so he's in this position after 1830 of raising 3 motherless children by himself. And he leaves town for a couple of years to work on the engraving of Ariadne. And while he's in this sort of place of mournfulness and grief, trying to figure out how to be a widower, the only things that he paints during, I think it's 2 whole years in Camptown, New Jersey, is Ariadne. He does the engraving, and this, the Durand children, a portrait of the kids, which makes me want to spend the next 6 months trying to figure out a way to make that picture of Ariadne a sort of memorial or homage somehow to his wife. But I have no scholarship to back that up. I just think this is weird. His kids and Ariadne, the only 2 things he works on for 2 years in this particular moment. All right, now I'm going to speed up. So, after Ariadne, and upon returning to the art scene in New York City triumphant with Art World favor, he becomes close with Luman Reed, who is a name you might remember from Thomas Cole. He's a patron of both artists. And he executes a series of commissions of important founding fathers on canvas. So this is that paint to pay your rent scenario that we've talked about with other artists. So here you've got Andrew Jackson. Here you've got James Madison. And just because I can, little amusing fact when you're looking at this, all those ideas about sort of struggle and temptation that Graham is making his followers think about all the time, well, they really liked to emphasize the moments in which they were particularly tempted. They liked to write about them and mourn them and grieve about all their temptations, particularly around food, right? Because he had this whole restrictive diet. So when Durand gets the commission to execute a portrait of former President James Madison, his writings sort of gently complain that he was, quote, in continual danger of all the consequences resulting from the delicacies of Dolly Madison's famously rich table. So even taking on a commission like this put him at risk of not being quite as straight-laced as he wanted to be. But he is also, on his own, starting to shift his gaze more to the landscape, as you can see in some of these early works. But he hasn't yet fully found his footing in the new tradition of American landscape. And he won't find it until after about 1837, when he and Thomas Cole, here you can see portraits of both of them by Durand, go on a trip to the Adirondack Mountains together. They take their wives, it's not just the boys, and they go to Schroon Lake. And it's a really influential trip for Durand because he's experiencing the grandeur of landscape painting from the guy who's sort of making it a name. And after the trip, they start exchanging letters, and they exchange lots and lots of letters for as long as Thomas Cole is alive. They become great friends. They spend a lot of time discussing artistic process. And you can actually sort of hear in Durand's words that he writes to Cole right after this trip. He says, I have, after several weeks of labor, become sick of the landscape which you saw me at work on. He hasn't quite gotten used to, I think, having focused on the landscape after the types of work that he had been doing before that. He's adjusting to his new interests. And just to sort of illustrate for you how close these two guys have actually become, this is a Thomas Cole sketch for the larger painting, and I did show this last time we were together, The Dream of Arcadia, and one of his beautiful sort of metaphorical, allegorical, pastoral scenes. And he gives this to Durand. Now, this is 1838. You can see the date in the top right corner, and the finished piece is exhibited in 1838. So this is not like a sketch that you found in the back of your journal that you were like, hey, this is kind of how I think. Do you want it? This is a very to-date work that is being exchanged between two artists as part of their conversation about art. You can also note that this is Thomas Cole trying his hand at trompe-l'oeil painting, paintings that trick the eye, because this is a painting of a drawing on a piece of board. It's not a drawing on a piece of board. He's painted that wood grain in there for you in those tattered little corners. The following year, after beginning these journeys with Thomas Cole into the landscape, Durand contributes 9 landscapes to the annual exhibition at the National Academy of Design. And he would then repeat that process, summer trips to sketch, followed by submission of landscape paintings to the annual exhibition for the next 2 years. He's made his shift. He's found the new path that he's going to follow. He makes a full-time commitment to this, and that commitment for most artists means a trip to Europe. So he goes to Europe with John Frederick Kensett and John William Casselier, 2 other American artists. And when they're on the ship, in April of 1840, he actually writes in his journal, he's sailing out of New York Harbor to London, and he writes, "Today again is Sunday. I have declined attendance on church service, the better to indulge reflection unrestrained under the high canopy of heavens, amidst the expanse of waters, a fit place to worship God and contemplate the wonders of his power." And I give you that direct quote because it's fairly representative, I think, of Durand's relationship to religion for the most of the rest of his life, which he indulged far more by visiting the church of nature than the physical buildings that house the church of man. That's how he's going to have this relationship. On their self-educating journey around Europe, the men visit Britain, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. And they spend their time copying the masters, often outdoors, as they're supposed to do. And for a short while, when he gets back, he submits landscapes like this, but for a very short while. He's very quickly reminded by the land in which he's living that that's actually the subject he's interested in, the American landscape, not any landscape, not European landscapes. And so you get more works like this, more works from the backyard scenes that he could go and sketch in summers, the topography in which he's immersed, the pastoral landscape in which he's immersed, and it's beautiful. I really like the solitary oak tree, and I think Durand is the solitary oak tree, just as another little thesis for you. But here's the beeches, and this is one of his more mature works. One thing he probably has brought back from England is this vertical composition, this vertical canvas that you haven't really seen Thomas Cole do much at all. And Durand is going to stay interested in this vertical format for a very long time. And one of the reasons I think this is significant is because as we're learning to look together at artworks so that you can find these in museums when I'm not there, by making these frames vertical instead of horizontal, he gives us a much greater sense of intimacy with what he's showing us, right? It's more human-sized in a lot of ways. It implies a smaller visual lens in accordance with Durand's belief in the close study of nature. The framing of nature encourages you to kind of get close up to it. And you can see very specific attention to what types of trees these are. You can see birch bark, you can see linden tree bark. He's paying a lot of attention to the fidelity of the natural details. And even though he does paint some people in his scenes for a little while here, even in scenes where there's some kind of human presence, like this one, and you'll note this is in the White House's collection, his attention is actually always on the topography. So when you're looking at something like this, what I think I always notice is that the sun is almost always falling on the cliff face, not the human faces. The luminosity is directing you at the wonders of the land and less dramatically on the wonders of what humans are up to in any particular scene. It is worth noting that this was a commission. He was asked to paint a distinctly American subject, and so he picked an American landscape with America's greatest symbol of Americanness, the native, a thing that you don't necessarily have anymore in Europe. And this is the hallmark of what's to come for Durand. Intense focus on geology, botany, and mineralogy, and a precise rendering often of things like sun, things like bark on trees, mossy patches. Here's another example. This is another one titled Indian Rescue. In spite of the title and a whole bunch of action it implies, right? Who is being rescued? Why is rescue necessary? What are the humans up to? Durand is actually mostly interested in that bit of craggy cliff that he is shining the sunlight on, as if sort of that bit of heroic nature is the actor in this particular play that we should actually be paying attention to. By 1840, Durand and Cole are very good friends. They are also popularly considered to be the two greatest landscape painters in the United States. And the press liked to imagine a sort of friendly competition between the two for the top seat. And their correspondence going back and forth does show that there's a little bit of that. Not a ton of it, there's a little bit. Cole maybe has a little bit of envy in the rising star of Durand, who's coming after him. Durand maybe has a little bit of envy that Thomas Cole is younger and very successful. They have a little bit of tension about what they think is the most important way to paint the landscape. But by and large, they're very respectful of each other, and they're sharing ideas back and forth. And so when Cole dies, he dies early, even for then, the National Academy of Design will ask William Cullen Bryant, the poet, to deliver the memorial in his honor. And Durand is the one who gets commissioned to paint an homage, a memorial to the two men's friendships, which then becomes a gift to the poet who gave the memorial. Very close, clubby little group of gentlemen. And I don't think anybody knew at the time that what they were commissioning was actually America's most famous double portrait, because it's two very influential humans. It's William Cullen Bryant and Thomas Cole exploring nature together. And we looked at this last week, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But one thing that I do think is really sweet is that Durand actually includes a reference to his own friendship with Cole in this painting, which isn't talked about a lot, because he includes this small recorder in the hand of Thomas Cole that you might be able to see it sort of pointing out over the ledge. He's the one with the top hat on. So he's got this small musical instrument in his hand, and the two artists had shared a deep mutual love of music and talking about music, and Durand actually referred to their friendship as C major and D flat. So that was part of their language for each other. But what's important to note here is that Thomas Cole dies early, and Durand is the obvious choice to pick up the mantle of what American landscape painting is going to be, and he does so enthusiastically. But he always, even when he advances his own theories, always and respectfully harkens back to Thomas Cole as you need to understand Cole to understand where we need to move forward. He wanted to push the movement forward, more attention to actual nature, less about allegory, but he was very deeply respectful of Thomas Cole. And so he's in this new role. He is now, as some critics have called him, the dean of the Hudson River School. He's exhibiting regularly paintings, several of them like this one, which is near Olive, New York, where he was summering. And it's a small scene that is investigating the delights of country leisure activities. So like Thomas Cole and the picnic, fishing for sport on a leisurely afternoon is a rising leisure pursuit for an American public more and more confined to cities. And Durand himself was an appreciator of outdoor leisure more generally, and apparently was quoted as being instructed by his sportsman eye, which means that sometimes he picked the things he wanted to paint because the fishing was good nearby. That's the way you read that. He does do a couple of these sort of Thomas Cole-inspired allegories after Thomas dies. Mostly, this one, like Thanatopsis, is actually a poem by William Cullen Bryant, so he's illustrating the themes of a poem on screen. It's a poem about impermanence and death, so you can see Durand labeling it Thanatopsis and then showing us some natural decay. There's actually a little, does this have a pointer? No. A little funeral in the background under the copse of trees. But he's not maybe as good at it as Cole is, and it isn't really his jam, if you will, so he doesn't do it for very long. This is one of the most noteworthy ones that he tries, this sort of departure from the close study of nature in favor of something sort of more metaphorical, and it's probably the boldest endorsement that he will give us of American expansion. It's commissioned by New York collector Charles Gould, and it sort of shows us the advancement of American progress across the Hudson River landscape. But it's not really metaphorical in any way. You do have in the bottom left-hand corner in this bit of still rough landscape some native folks looking out kind of with worry as a glorious city rises in the background. And this little path from the bottom right corner brings a seemingly endless series of humans ready to cut things down and build up more cities. There's even a little railroad in the background. And two critics have called this two different things, both of which I like. One called it an industrialist's fantasy of manifest destiny. And you can read it that way because he's not really telling us not to do it. But another called it a depiction of the landscape of investment, which I think is another genre of landscape painting that deserves more attention. I like that phrase. But by 1855, Durand is making seasonal trips along the Hudson River. He's going to the Adirondacks, to New England, often with other artists, with his family. He's sketching in pencil and oil. And he's been head of the National Academy for quite some time. And one of the reasons that he's so successful, one of the reasons that all of these artists are so successful, is because this is where those of you who are here for the science and not the art start to wake up a little bit. The change in reputation, the ability for someone painting like this to have the reputation that Durand had, is partly, at least, based on rising interest in scientific theories in the mass public. They're more or less being widely disseminated by the 1840s and 50s when he's doing this. So, for instance, in the 19th century, there are many, I think we all know this, well-publicized crises of faith precipitated by science. I'm just going to skip right past Darwin, because it's still a crisis for some people. But one of the things we don't necessarily talk about that much is kind of what the crisis was that was precipitated by geology. So, for instance, think about it this way. It's worth considering that until very recently, really until the 19th century, geology and geography are conflated disciplines for quite some time. So the rocks of the land and the study of those rocks, they're more or less conflated. We haven't created a scientifically reliable form of geology until very recently. So the first geological study of the United States ever was produced in 1809. So if you think how much we didn't know about how the land worked, we knew where we were, but not how the land was working, that's pretty late. It was a self-imposed task from one sort of tinkerer and adventurer. He ended up publishing it as his memoir, along with a map, and that's actually how we got the first map. It wasn't commissioned by the government or anything like that. And just to put this in perspective, the United States' first geological map actually predates that of England by 6 years. So the entire world is coming to terms with geology as a science and what this study means. Now, John Ruskin, another prominent thinker about the natural world at this time, is a British critic and writer, and he is arguing, and he's widely shared, that the real scientific man is the one who can embrace not only the laws that be, but who can feel to the full the beauty and truth of all that nature has to show as the Creator made him. So scientist as lover of God's nature. Ruskin himself, and I'm showing you this on purpose, was an inveterate maker of studies of extraordinary aesthetic quality. This is gorgeous as a study of rocks. But he actually never ended up making full-scale paintings. I actually think maybe he had a little promise. But he was more interested in promoting the science, and he used art to do it. But you can see in these sort of studies of close-up clumps of grass and incisive visual analyses of rocks and water that he's both a natural historian and he's also an artist, for sure. Durand has a similar clear-eyed reverence for the physical world, and you get these beautiful rocky landscapes from Durand, both in his exhibition Pictures and Studies. this is like the most honest version of nature ever. It's not slicked over. He hasn't fixed any of the imperfections of nature like Thomas Cole sometimes did in the studio. He's giving you raw rocks, the way they appear. They're usually unsigned and undated, his early studies, but his small-scale studies, they're knockouts. I encourage you to see them. They're actually all over the web. There's lots of collections in New England. There are these sort of knockout portraits of trees and undergrowth and exposed roots and soil, everything that Durand referred to as, quote, earth banks. That's what he was studying, the earth banks, on ledges and rocky stream beds. And like Ruskin, he's stressing that importance of drawing when approaching nature. So he was very specific. You take pencil and paper, not palette and brushes, to go out to study. That comes later. Now, one other person we need to know about is Charles Lyell. And what's worth noting here is that evidence that the earth was far older than biblical scholars had supposed was unsettling to a lot of people. Some embraced, but not all. And Charles Lyell actually lays out the principles of geology in 1830. He's trying to turn into a science those things that most scientists understood in a way that like the common man would be able to embrace and understand. Because one of the things that was happening was people were starting to buy into various scientific disciplines, including geology, and still somehow managing to believe that the Earth was hit by a comet 1,000 years ago, or that mountains popped up like mushrooms in the middle of landscapes like last decade. They weren't reconciling these various time frames, and Lyell really wanted to do that. And so he published The Principles of Geology in 1830, and this is, again, very widely disseminated and widely read across the country. And so what's happening is that nearly everywhere, Americans are collecting rocks and minerals for the first time. They're attending public lectures on geology. They're surveying the Earth's composition. And the upper Hudson Valley would actually become a really important site for some of these geological explorations because they had to figure things out, like, how's the Erie Canal going to work? You know who's going to help you with that? Geologists, people who can actually understand what's happening in the various strata of the land. The interest in geology reached so far beyond official surveys that various magazines, the Knickerbocker being one of them, wrote, "It is indeed the fashionable science of the day." Did you not know, guys, in 2018? Geology, it's the most fashionable of all the sciences. But it offered people more than a glimpse of the Earth's strata, right? It opened a window onto moral and religious truths that had to be reckoned with. And so landscape painters are then, they become the interpreters of this natural truth that the entire country is reckoning with. And it is in this environment in which Durand, post-Cole, publishes Letters on Landscape Painting, in which he sort of codifies all of the tenets and principles of the Hudson River School painters generally, adds his own plein air painting, got to do it from nature, which Thomas Cole would have been less vociferous about probably. You have to provide scientific verisimilitude to what you are presenting. And he delivers this in this sort of funny tone of like a teacher teaching an anonymous student, like finger wagging, if you read it that way. And he's basically saying you got to go first to nature to learn how to paint it, and then you can do her justice. And so you see him studying individual foliage of trees. And this philosophy that he's publishing, this is much more Ruskin and Lyell or even Darwin than it is Thomas Cole. Thomas Cole, who gave us the course of empire, landscape, as allegory for human destruction. And if you think about the idea that a single rock formation in the mid-19th century represented a growing argument about human existence and history in our entirety, the desire to paint that rock perfectly takes on a particular significance, right? So this new and widespread interest in geological theory was a radical one. It called into question the validity of the Christian story of creation and the entire notion of human history that people had been raised on. And so the close study of the stratification of these rock surfaces is not as benign as its prettiness conveys. Because if you think about it, raw rock is the table of contents of God's creation, if you believe in God. Raw rock takes eons to shape. Raw rock is what you make your gravestones out of because it endures. Raw rock can be shattered by a tiny, tenacious weed that wriggles just so. And so the texture and structure of rock is fascinating to Durand. And it also, as opposed to a tree, or a lake or a river, presents very particular compositional challenges, which he has to tackle in a variety of ways, because rocks do all sorts of gnarly things after they've been worn down. Rocks are also as specific as fingerprints to the geologically inclined, and because Durand is paying an almost scientific homage to these rock faces when he's painting his landscapes, sometimes some funny, weird things happen over time. So this, for instance, this was a gift from the artist family to the museum that it lives in, and it was brought in with the title the Shawangunks, which is a region up there in the Catskills. But rock climbers who maybe next to Durand know rocks better than anybody is like tooling around the museum looking at the various artworks and is like, just for the record, that's not the Shawangunks. I know exactly where that is. I can tell you exactly where that composition of ledges is, but it's not where you think it is. It's right here. It's Cathedral Ledge. And so, you know, the art historians did all their background research, did all the tracking, figured out that, oh, yeah, it turns out that when someone was guessing what this was, Durand that summer was near Cathedral Ledge, not in this other part of the Catskills. So they actually went back and renamed the painting, because that is how specific his details of the actual geography are. Here's another masterful painting for you. As one critic noted about this piece, its rocks are wholly right. Their weight is right, their cracks are right. Equally correct are the feathers of green ferns that grow out of their cliffs and the colors of their lichens. A somewhat churchy mood sometimes mars his larger works, but his small studies like this one have lost none of their impact. They still feel like the truth. And I really like that. These are so much more intimate than those vast panoramas of Thomas Cole, aren't they? Certainly, they are more fathomable than the unfathomable things we're going to look at in the last three talks when we're looking at the Grand Canyon and Ecuador and Yosemite and thousand-year-old trees. So this is all cool granite, lush vegetation. It's a closed-in little vignette that Durand gives us. And each little bit of lichen and jut of rock is romantic to him. He's not creating melodrama around it. It's perfect as it is. And it's even worth noting that as his philosophy on this changes, as he starts to think of himself almost as a scientific chronicler of the world through art, even his titles change. So it's been noted that this is symptomatic of wide-ranging changes in American art, but early on, I don't know if you noticed this, but his studies were called compositions, composition of a tree, composition of a rock. But as he buys more and more into this philosophy of studying nature, they become studies of, almost as if plein air sketching is a form of scientific research. He's adding that sort of layer to what he's trying to do. And some critics have noted also that in a lot of ways, these smaller studies actually break with all previous conventions of landscape paintings. They're empirical, they're immediate, they're alive with joy of fresh perceptions, and they have a modern look. There's no sign of cultural appropriation from Europe anywhere on here. It is a quintessentially American rock. And that, believe it or not, was revolutionary. Now, the use of the sketching expedition for more thoroughly scientific purposes means that a day trip is no longer enough. And so these trips that he takes start to get a little bit longer. One of his patrons went on one of these with him, Edward Nelson, and he gave us a picture in his own writings of what it was like to go on these research expeditions with Durand. My favorite thing is that once they found the spot that they wanted to move off from, they didn't want to carry their materials all over. They had to go pick places. So they would first search for a hollow log in which they would stash all the art supplies, and then they'd go looking for vantage points and set up their little stools and draw. And then you could go back and get more materials, and you could be out there for days. I think it sounds lovely, but I want you to keep that in mind as the version of the artist explorer at this point, because you're going as far as the Catskills. Now imagine if you're trying to do the same level of like empirical study of the landscape, but that landscape is, I don't know, Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. Our artists are going to get quite a bit more adventurous. But Durand is plucky enough to find himself a hollow log to stash these things in. And sometimes on a typical trip up to that area, Durand would stay for not just weeks, but months. Not in the wilderness the whole time, but stationed close enough to sort of go out his back door on these smaller nature trips. So, the point that I want to make here is that all of this access to nature and science changes America fundamentally, and therefore also the art that it will consume. In 1844, Charles Briggs of the Art Union's Committee of Management verbalized the benefit for the entire nation that landscape artists was perceived as bringing. And he said, "To the inhabitants of cities, as nearly all of the subscribers to the Art Union are, a painted landscape is almost essential to preserve a healthy tone to the spirits, lest they forget in their wilderness of bricks," love that, "which surrounds them, the pure delights of nature and a country life. Those who cannot afford a seat in the country to refresh their wearied spirits may at least have a country seat in their parlors." So these were perceived as performing a really essential function in a growing United States. Now I'll give you a few last canvases that are really sort of grand, beautiful Durand pieces. This is In the Woods. It's one of his largest and most majestic expressions of these ideas of close study and intimacy with nature, and it has that churchy feel. So you've got these two trees, one dead, one living, both sort of leaning inwards to form this arched opening in the forest interior, and beyond them other trees are sort of intertwining, branches are making a leafy canopy. And essentially what you've got is the natural vaulted equivalent of the cathedral vault to walk through. At the far end, where a church's altar would be, you can see the trees revealing to part just the distant prospect of a mountaintop in the background there. And so it's not really a surprise that sometimes people read churchy bits into his landscapes. You've also got, this is the distinctly Durand thing, you've got these series of tree stumps. Their tops are all splintered and their heartwood is crumbling. They stretch from the foreground all the way to the middle ground along this left bank that you see in front of you. And you've got this prostrate trunk that's felled in the very front that's rotting. But what's also very cool, if you can see it, is that the rot sort of trickles all the way over to this patch of ferns in the bottom right corner, almost as if it's directly fertilizing the regeneration that is happening around it. And I love the fallen trees the most, and I'll tell you why. Because those fallen trees, if you think about it, this is an edge of the woods and you are standing at it. Those fallen trees force you to interrupt your path into the forest. You can't go very fast. You can't swiftly move through this landscape, right? You have to actually, your brain has to catch up with your eye that's darting everywhere and think, okay, I'm going to have to step over that one with my right foot, and then I'm going to sink my left foot into this puddle, and I'm going to have to move around it. So they sort of slow you down. They slow down your eye, but they also imply that we should be slower in nature. They ask us to pay greater attention. Now, I do want to acknowledge in this same vein, for those of you who have been sitting in your seat for the last 45 minutes going, okay, but I thought I knew what it meant when there was a tree in the painting, because she told me last week that the tree means a thing. Let me point out to you that Cole and Durand are trying to achieve very different things. So the allegorical in Cole is not the same as the allegorical in Durand. But I do think you can think about it this way. Like the single ancient tree felled by man in a sublime Cole painting, which is a symbol of our utter and impending downfall. Durand, too, is using the fallen tree to call your attention to something, but he's trying to call your attention to the miracle that is the natural cycle of birth and death and regeneration that happens naturally around us. He wants you to think about God's forest regenerating in front of your very eyes. So that's a different way to think about it, but those trees are for sure down for a reason. You're allowed to keep watching for trees. They still mean something. They just mean something different. Now, I apologize that I don't have quite as good a version of this image as the other ones, but I couldn't get a high-res version of it. But I thought this would be just a funny little takeaway for you, because I think it's an interesting story. This is a beautiful view across the Genesee Valley, which is up in the Hudson River. It was owned by Daniel Wadsworth, who owned this huge tract of Hudson River Valley land and a huge proponent of the arts. Wadsworth Athenaeum might ring a bell. And a collector. And Durand traveled out there twice to sketch on this commission that he had been asked to do. It's 1859. He takes the sketches back. He works up the final piece. It's beautiful. And you can actually see later pictures of his studio, because who doesn't want to see inside the artist, either their studio or their house, one or the other. You can actually see 7 different studies of Genesee oaks still on view in his studio. So all the work that went into that, which I just think is cool. But also, if you can see in sort of the top third, amusing, at least to me, you can see all of these tiny sculptures of cows. Some of them are standing, some of them are reclining. And I think I just found the clue to who posed for all of these pastoral scenes and why they're almost always cows. Cole had a lot more deer in his. Durand has a lot more cows, and there's an awful lot of cows on view in his studio. But what I wanted you to think about is that when the Wadsworth family began to sell and lease that huge tract of land to local farmers, they actually put in their contracts that a certain number of trees, even if you were leasing their land or buying it from them, had to be preserved on each of the smaller parcels that they were carving up and selling off. So these statuesque trees that dominate Durand's paintings stirred not only his own imaginations and sensibilities, but those of the private industrialists and businessmen that he's painting for. It's not a coincidence that New York would become the first state to enshrine its forestry goals in its state constitution. And that would actually happen in 1894. They used the famous language that, quote, the land was to stay forever wild. The mountains and valleys that they lived in, that New Yorkers lived in, including the moneyed ones, especially the moneyed ones, and which Durand and Cole are painting, these are the first real images of ecological destruction in progress. And therefore, they also presented the people who lived there with the first great opportunities to do something about it. And if you think about those two dual roles, so that's why I thought that was an interesting painting. Now we are towards the end of his life and career. In 1869, Durand would retire to his native Maplewood, New Jersey, away from the hustle and bustle to a newly built home and studio. And of course, as you're going to hear at the end of most of these talks, interest in the romantic, natural ideal that he presented was starting to wane. Now, some younger, more blustering artists are going to come in after him and explode it up a little bit again with their grand panoramas. But we're sort of in the sweet spot. When you get to the 1860s and 1870s, these sweet little studies are kind of going out of fashion. And by 1900, some of these artists who are incredibly famous in their life are dying totally unknown. It's a rapidly changing American taste for art. But he's doing just fine. He's retired. He doesn't need to make a splash anymore. He continued painting. He kept at it. This is a fairly late picture called The Sketcher. In 1872, and I just think this is very sweet, he was feted at home by 20 of his former colleagues from the National Academy of Design. And his work was absolutely included in the Centennial Exhibition in 1876 in Philadelphia. He paints all the way up until 1879, which is his 9th decade, and he would die on September 17th, 1886, at age 90. Fairly illustrious career, especially for someone who is the dean of American landscape painting, but who didn't actually start painting the American landscape until, like mid-career. So we can all still accomplish great things. And so I'm going to leave you with this as the last slide, because it is such a perfect Durand. And what I want to leave you with is this. Unlike Cole, who gets credit for founding a movement, or those landscape artists who got to go on wild adventures to the edge of the known world, Durand's story is actually pretty sedate, with the exception of that little rabbit hole I went down with Graham and the graham crackers and no sex for anyone ever. But this is a pretty sedate story. But here's the important thing. Somebody has to take an idea and turn it into a movement. It doesn't happen by itself. Maybe Thomas Cole could have done it, but he didn't. He died. And so it's Durand who helps to build this loosely connected network of artists interested in the truths that the American landscape has to share, and who wrote the essays that codified an entire belief system that underscored the basic tenets of all the Hudson River School artists, and, I would argue, started codifying America's ongoing relationship with the land and what we want from it, what we want to give to it, how we want to study it. He wasn't the most religious or the most dramatic of the artists we'll talk about. He wasn't the greatest showman, and he didn't have the craziest adventures. He was, I would argue, the strong oak tree in the middle of a changing landscape of American art. So there you have it. Asher B. Durand.